On today's episode, we decided to switch it up a bit. With the rise in popularity of platforms like Clubhouse and the popularity of AMA sessions, Ask Me Anything sessions, I decided to start periodically running live podcast episodes with audience involvement. This was the first one, and I call these AMAA sessions, Ask Me Almost Anything sessions, because we're going to focus on a particular topic in these. If you want to get involved in the live sessions, head over to path2product.io. That's path2product.io, and sign up for free to join the community. And unlike Clubhouse, these are going to be recorded and shared on this podcast, and they're also on the Path to Product YouTube channel. So if you want the video version, you can jump over there, subscribe, and catch these episodes there. With no further ado, let's jump into the conversation I had with Ryan Seamons, founder at Groove, who formerly worked at Degreed as Director of Product and was one of the first PMs at LinkedIn to work on what we now know as LinkedIn Learning. Welcome back to Lessons in Product Management. Let's get started. Hey, Ryan, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
Yeah, likewise. So we're doing something a little different with Path to Product, having our first Ask Me Almost Anything session. So a little more geared towards a specific topic. All right. So Ryan, just as background for the listeners here and for those who are listening after kind of post live recording, you've been a PM at LinkedIn, you've been a director of product at Degreed, co-founder and chief product officer at Sprintwell, and now you're founder at Groove. So could you kind of take us through kind of your experiences in the learning domain onto what you learned at Sprintwell and how that insight came about that kind of founded Groove and kind of the reason behind it?
Yeah, so my like a lot of PMs, my career path has been a little wonky. I did my undergrad in a computer science related field. I found out through an internship that I didn't want to code and sit at a desk doing that all day. And I don't think I even knew what product was until I started getting it at LinkedIn. I was kind of this kind of black sheep as I went through different jobs, and I knew technology. I liked the business side of things. When I got to LinkedIn, I actually joined in an HR role. So I did my MBA with an emphasis in organizational behavior. And when I got there, this was just as LinkedIn was starting to think a little bit more seriously about learning. They'd hired a director of learning, and this director of learning said, "Hey, I'd really love to build, something different that could be more geared towards informal learning that people would actually like to use versus some of the old traditional LMS systems." And so I happened to be in the room when that was said, and we didn't have any developers in HR, and so I raised my hand and said, "Hey, I know how to prototype stuff. Let's work on something." That ended up becoming internally it was called Learn-In, which was the seed of today what is LinkedIn Learning. And so that's kind of where I cut my teeth, made a million mistakes, and learned a lot. I mean, it was a great place to learn product, to become a product manager and build a team. As I transitioned to Degreed, for me, a lot of my experience has been at this intersection of talent and technology. And so the learning companies, that worked really well. And yeah, it was a fun experience. When I left Degreed and founded Sprintwell, it was this based on this idea with a friend who started it first, and this idea that the way work happens is usually a little challenging. And we started just facilitating design sprints because people were looking for better ways to work, wanted to know how can we create better products faster. The insight and what kind of led to Groove is that we first started coaching product teams and helping teams build better products. And we found that the more work we did, the more we kept getting sucked into working on teams themselves. People said, well, if we could teach us how to do this, we could build the product. We don't necessarily need that insight, but we need to know things like, how do we trust each other? How do we collaborate? How do we get aligned as a team? How do we stay true to priorities? How do you give hard feedback to executives and managers so they even know how to create environments where people can work? And so we started getting more and more into that work. As the pandemic hit and things changed consulting wise for a little while, I had a chance to pull up, and that kind of led to Groove, this idea of helping people at the intersections of work, especially relationships between employees and managers and executives, and this idea of alignment and how work happens. And so with Groove, I started with a single idea around a card deck that I'd seen before. I've got one here that helps people have better conversations about their careers, because this is one of those conversations that's super critical to have, but a lot of people either never have it, or if they do have it, it's clunky. Managers don't know how to approach it. Employees feel a little awkward in those conversations. So we developed this card deck and exercise and some guides to help people have better career conversations, to decide what matters most in their career and then carve a path forward, using actually some principles from product. And then as we've been working on this, there's some other products that we're working on at intersection points of work, things like performance conversations, as well as conversations about purpose, about strategy and culture at work. And then we also working on some manager training, so some mini courses and kind of bite-sized approaches to manager training as well.
That's really cool because I think people trying to get into product management or who are currently who are trying to hone their skills, it's mostly focused on those hard skills, right? Like how can I get better at research, or how can I get better at, data analysis, or things that are more tangible. But what stuck out to you with all these product teams that you worked with and consulted for was that the softer skills around communication and specific types of communication with specific types of conversations is really what helped enable teams to move forward in a very productive way.
Yeah, for sure. I think we vastly underestimate the impact that the way we work as a team has on how we build products. And so when your team doesn't have trust, it can't move fast. And when your team doesn't know how to talk to each other, when you don't know how to keep priorities straight and communicate priority changes, I mean, that's what causes so much of the stress that's really common for product managers. It's a really stressful job because a lot of times a lot is happening. And we think, oh, if I just do better analysis, and it's not that those things are bad. Those are good things. And, you need to learn those as product managers. But there's a different way to approach getting aligned and staying aligned at work that I found reduces a lot of stress and helps you build better products and put those hard skills then to good use.
For sure. For sure. So if you had to like create a taxonomy or like a categorization of the type of like conversations that you might be having, like how would you break up those major categories? Is it like career progression and like tough conversations, or like what are some of the main breakouts that you see?
Yeah, there's maybe a couple things I'll say here, because for product managers specifically, I think there's a lot of customer conversations that are important, right? When you're doing user research and doing discovery, I think those are critical. When you talk about internal conversations, for me, there's three major ones. And I put them in this order. Number one, what do I care about in my career? And I think this is an important first conversation, because a lot of times companies skip this thinking like, oh, you've got it figured out. But as employees, if we don't know that our company cares about us, I don't know that my manager invests in me, it can be really difficult to bring my best self to work. It can be really difficult to want to stay with the company. The lack of career development is the number one reason people leave companies. And so this is a huge impact to the team, and it's very worthwhile for companies and managers to invest in it. Conversation number two is around this question of what's expected of me at work. And for PMs, I think this is critical because a lot of times we assume, oh, I'm a product manager. Cool. I know I'm going to do all the product things. And we define our job by our role or the activities we do, instead of really saying, well, what's the impact that I need to have? What am I supposed to deliver to the organization? What phase is our product in? And because of that, what am I going to be doing? And so thinking about setting your own expectations, as well as then getting into performance conversations. And, performance conversations are some of the worst conversations at work. Managers hate them, employees hate them. And so that's kind of another thing around just expectations. What's expected of myself? What do I expect of others? And having that conversation. The third conversation, I think this one is really critical for product managers, is around purpose and strategy. For any employee, I think it's important to understand what is the purpose of our company? What's our vision? What is our culture like? And how do I understand that? How do I talk about that and maybe give input to that? For product managers, I mean, you're at the center of all this. When you think about strategy and how we're moving forward, I think product managers, almost more than any other position, at a more junior level, are going to have influence on this just because of the nature of the role. And so for me, these three conversations about career, what do I care about most of my career, kind of for myself, about performance, what's expected of me and what I'm actually doing, and then purpose, I think are really critical to have. And the other thing I'll say is it's common to want to flip all of those to say, let's start with our purpose and then we'll talk about what's expected of you. And then we'll get to your career later. But I found that actually flipping them the other way, saying, let's talk about you first so we understand you. Let's talk about what's going on and what you expect, and then let's tie that to the broader vision. And it becomes this kind of cyclical thing back and forth where you iterate on it and it informs each other. It can be really helpful.
No, for sure. I've been a part of organizations where we've had those conversations. There's organizational shifts, and it leads to questions of, okay, well, based on this shift, like what is the path? Like what are my career options? And the answer is, well, I didn't really think about that. And that's kind of deflating, right? But then yep. I've interviewed with companies where like, that's the first thing is, where do you want to be in your career? And like the mentality behind that is just, it's so telling and so different, like culturally, how you can expect to kind of operate within that company and what you can expect from like a career growth opportunity. So for those of you who are listening, who are interviewing, those are some things you might want to look out for or ask about. So.
Yeah, it's one of those interesting things to think about We tend to trust people who they seem to have low self-interest. Meaning if I'm talking to someone and they only care about themselves and everything they're asking is like, me, what can you give me? Our trust goes down. And so for companies, a simple way to build trust is to invest small amounts of time in asking those questions. What do you care about? Well, what drives you in your career? What do you really want in the future? And can we be aligned to help you get that? That goes such a long way. And yeah, for those interviewing, I think it's an important thing to ask about career progression. And also note that for career, I'm not talking just about promotion. I think a lot of people say, oh, when can I be up for promotion? When can I be? And it's like money is one factor. But I mean, in the deck that we built, we've got 50 different words. One of them is compensation, but there's 49 other words. And we cut a lot of words out as well that aren't included in the deck of all these things that can be motivating to us. Because non-economic drivers are incredibly important, but they're rarely talked about. It's very easy for us to talk about value in terms of economics, but the non-economic things are critical too.
For sure. So I'm going to touch on one of the 3 points that you mentioned, or one of the 3 pillars, and I'm going to kind of open it up to the audience to ask some questions from what they've heard so far. But
Sure.
thinking about performance, right? I know that we said the most critical is like, where do you want to go in your career? But I'm gonna do the bad thing and go another route.
No, that's okay. Well, and I'll say they all build on each other. It's not like one is necessarily more important. I think it's important to start with that, but I think each of these has a place and purpose. So yeah, let's talk about performance. I think it's a good one.
For sure. So like, if you can give an example of what those conversations look like, maybe the manager doesn't want to have that conversation, or just isn't having that conversation, but the PM wants to know that they're doing a good job, or wants to know what their expectations are. How does the PM kind of lead up to start that conversation?
Yeah, that's a great question, because story time. I experienced this, and maybe other people have experienced this too. This typically happens in 2 times. One, either you have a performance conversation, your annual performance review, and a lot of times managers will save feedback up like that they haven't really been sharing, because it's hard to share tough feedback. And so, they're like, oh, I got to kind of like dump out like, hey, you didn't do this well. And employees are nervous about, even if it ends up being good, it's a nervous, coming up to a performance conversation. Is it going to be good? I don't know. But for me, the other time that this conversation comes up is when you screw something up. And I had this happen at work. I was a product manager and I made a pretty big mistake. And it was like, man, it impacted some client stuff, and like devs it was just like, I was kind of at the center, and if anyone was responsible, it was probably me. And so what happened after this? Well, my boss came to me and, he said, okay, why did this ball drop? And so my boss told me, well, you really should be doing that. Why don't you go and like write down your job description? Because, like, it's been a while since we hired you, and like, I don't know, we're just like doing all the things now, but like, why don't you sit down and write that down? And I said, okay, like, I guess I'll go do that. So I open up a blank document, kind of, stare at the blinking cursor, and it's like, okay, what do? I don't know. And I start typing for like 5 minutes. Oh, I do this and this and this and this and this. And then it's like, how do I don't know. It's like a million things. I don't know. It changes every week. Like, it depends what people ask. And then, I put that down, work comes up, and often then things speed back up. It's in the past, and we just forgot about it all, and we kind of never come back to it. And that's happened to me a couple times in my career. Maybe that's common for other people when mistakes are made. A better way to approach that conversation is a place where, as an employee, I can own what my expectations are, because I'm the one who can actually have a say in that and direct that. And that's going to help me be more successful in my job and more likely to get promoted in the future. And managers, the problem is we wish that a manager would kind of tell us what our job description should be. Like, hey, you hired me, like, you tell me. But they hired you because they're overworked, they're stressed out, they've got a million things to do. And so a better process for having that conversation, I found, is taking some time to answer 3 key questions. And so if you've heard of a listening tour or are familiar with that, I'm a big fan of this. A lot of times executives will do this when they come into a company, where they'll talk to a lot of stakeholders. They'll sit down. And for me, there's actually 3 questions that I invite PMs to ask people when they're thinking about, well, what is my performance based on? Like, what is expected of me, and how can I balance? Because I have lots of stakeholders. So you meet with someone, maybe an engineering partner or lead, maybe someone in sales or marketing, maybe your boss, and you ask 3 questions. You say, what are you trying to accomplish today related to my role? Like, what things are you doing that you'd expect from me? And, you start talking about kind of, oh, well, here are things that kind of intersect with you. And then you say, great, how is that going today? What things are going well, what things aren't going well. And then the third question you ask is, okay, well, what could be better? Like, what what are your future expectations? Like, what could this look like? And so I would advise someone to do maybe 5 to 10 interviews like this, where you're sitting down for 20, 30-minute conversations, just gathering some input. And as you gather this, then you're able to create a 1-page document about your expectations. Well, I've got all these stakeholders. Here's some of the things. They're going to say some similar things. There's this that could be successful, this that could be successful. And just like we would put a product 1-pager together where we talk about, well, why are we doing this? What does success look like? And how are we going to proceed? You can do the same for yourself with your role to say, okay, well, why am I here? What does success look like for my role? What are those metrics that I'm really responsible for? And how am I proceeding? What's my kind of high level roadmap? Again, this doesn't have to be a really detailed doc. This is just high level. Then I found that going back and when you talk to those people again, you can say, oh, hey, by the way, I got to put together, this is kind of how I'm benchmarking my own success to make sure that I deliver value for you and other stakeholders. I just wanted to see if you have any input, any reaction to this, anything missing or anything that's surprising. And you have some really rich conversations, because sometimes someone will say, well, oh, the most important metric is this one. Like, why isn't that there? You say, oh, well, actually, marketing and sales, they say that. And well, we should get to talk together if you think that's important, because now we're at odds. And that's one of the things that causes stress for so many PMs is different people have different expectations about success. And they say, well, I don't care whatever other people want. I want this. And now you're able to actually talk about it. So long answer, but the crux of it is this process of kind of listening to your stakeholders, building 1-page document, and then saying, hey, I'm trying to add value. So I've written down expectations. Do you have any what feedback do you have on this? Is a great way to start the conversation versus without any of those tools. It can be really frightening just to go open up and be like, so what do you think I should do at work? I don't know what's going on. This is a much more kind of proactive way to lean into that.
For sure. There was something I read somewhere that was pretty similar to that, where they advised to ask like 3 questions of, like, what am I doing today that I should stop doing? What am I doing today that I should start doing more of? And what am I not doing today that I should be doing? It seems to mirror that pretty well.
Yeah. Taking time for reflection on how things are going, I think is well worth the time, but it's often easy to miss that at work.
For sure. Cool, Ryan. So those are the questions I had. I want to kind of open it up to the audience now. So if you have a question, you could either put it in the chat or raise your hand. So under the reactions tab on Zoom, just raise your hand and then I can let you ask it live. It's up to you. So I'd like to keep the questions to the topic, since it's an Ask Me Almost Anything session. So around career conversations, but if there's none around careers, there's another question in the chat that's more general advice. So opening it up to the floor. All right, well, but while people think of their questions, I'll ask you the general question. So
sure.
For a lot of the aspiring PMs in Path to Product don't have direct like product management experience before. And so like one of the conundrums that Path to Product is trying to solve is like, how do we help bridge that gap in product management experience before you get the job? But do you have like other advice or just general advice for those who don't have experience to start gaining experience that's seen as credible, since you've been in those hiring positions before?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, it is really hard. It can be really hard to break in. It's one reason that a lot of times people come from engineering backgrounds, because they've been building stuff and it's maybe easier to parlay that into product experience. For me, a clear thing that I look for is somebody with a product mind. And by a product mind, I mean someone who's thinking about questions like, what could be better about this? What problem are we actually trying to solve? How could we deliver something that would solve a need that someone would find valuable? And so whether that's looking at your phone and the apps you use and being cognizant of that and thinking about that, ideally for me, I'm super impressed when someone has some sort of side project. I mean, even something as simple as a blog or a little e-commerce store, something little that they just say, hey, I saw this problem or opportunity. I did something about it and like I released this. And just showing that ability, because for me, an important characteristic of a product manager are people who go through brick walls. It is a very difficult position to do well, because you're in the center of all this activity, trying to coordinate and figure out who to say no to, how to move things forward. And so I want to see proof that you've done that, or you're kind of leaning into that in some way, shape, or form. I've also, one other thing that can be helpful depending on what position you are in the organization. I coached someone recently who was in a customer service type role. They were on the customer advocacy team, and they were interested in product. And so they started getting to know the product managers in their org or other product managers at other companies. They asked if they could help with any projects, or, even just said, hey, do you need an hour or two of research on something? Or like, I just love to start to think about this. And I think that as well can go a long way, and starting to get the kind of little grains of sand of experience that you can then use to kind of get more experience and then finally get a role.
Very cool. And so Aaron Black asked, it sounds like stakeholder conversations, but you can correct me if I'm wrong. How do you get buy-in for questions? So some asking, maybe getting an insight from data or from a customer. So what about X, Y, or Z? And a decision maker or an executive stakeholder says, don't worry about that.
Yeah, that's a good question, Aaron. One of my favorite techniques, this comes from the book Never Split the Difference. And so this book is written by an ex-FBI. He was the head of the FBI hostage negotiation program. It's a really great book, one of the best that I've read in the past few years. And he talks about the technique that he used that they found extremely effective against terrorists, hostage, all these kinds of people, was this simple question: how can I make that work? And I think that's a critical question for PMs because, with your example, I love the question like, okay, well, what about this? And the decision maker says, don't worry about that. Well, the problem, and this is usually when stakeholders are answering questions, you have some context that you're like, oh, crap. Like, well, if we don't worry about that, there's this thing and this. And so as a PM, I think one of the best places a PM can be is when you're non-emotionally just facilitating trade-off discussions and decisions. When you say, don't worry about that. Hey, that's great. That's going to impact this. How can we make that work? Like, okay, this is going to be impact. How could we do that? And suddenly you're inviting them to think and putting it back on them of like, oh, well, well, how can we make that work? For me, I found that another situation like that is really difficult is when somebody, when two stakeholders are at odds with each other. One stakeholder wants to prioritize one thing, another stakeholder wants to prioritize another thing. And it's like, crap, well, we can't do both things at once. Like we have to choose. And so you simply go to one or the other and say, I get it. Okay, this is compelling. This is interesting. How could we make that work? Given that so-and-so wants to prioritize this. You say, either they'll say, oh, well, it could go after that. Or they'll say, they'll say, no, this is more important. You say, great. Can we get together and talk about this? Because I think this would be really helpful. And now you're facilitating it simply by just asking like, cool, how can we make this work? I do the same thing with a product roadmap. I like one-page documents for product roadmaps as a kind of high level. And when someone says, oh, we need this by next week, you got to get this in. You'll pull up your product roadmap and say, okay, well, okay, these are the things we have right now that we're working on. How can I make this work? And you start making them step back and think about it. And I mean, it won't solve all the problems. Sometimes they're still like, I don't care, just shove it in. But it gets the discussion going a little more and can help open up some of that opportunity. So good question, because it's a hard one.
For sure. So it looks like we have like time for maybe one more question. And I think this one might also kind of loop back into conversations, but maybe in that interview process. So Kate says, I'm interested in product management, but I'm concerned about the work-life balance of the role. So are there ways to manage it? Or is it generally like a poor work-life balance situation?
Yeah. Great. Yeah, that's a great question. It depends on your manager, and your company will determine a lot of that. And so in the interview process, I'd be careful. You don't want to ask things like, oh, can I just like check out at 5 o'clock? Or, that's not going to look well on you, but you can ask like, oh, what are the general hours? What's the expectation? When do people typically work? I asked this, I was interviewing with one of the major tech companies at one point, and I asked them, oh, do people, hey, do people ever work from home? Or, how does that typically work? And not like, oh, I have to work, but just saying, oh, like how did this work within other things? And I could hear from people, it was pretty clear. Like I had multiple people who looked at me and said like, I mean, I guess you could, but nobody does, which to me was like, if I want a remote job, this probably isn't the place for me. Another thing to note that's difficult with product is if you can learn how to say no, you will be much happier and less stressed. It is so easy to just say yes. Everyone comes and says, oh, let's do this and do this and do this. The art of product is really like the game of golf. You're rewarded for doing fewer things more accurately. And the problem is a lot of companies, there's if a person that I suggest you follow, John Cutler, he's at Amplitude as an evangelist. He's one of my favorite kind of thought leaders when it comes to product. He talks a lot about the ways that product teams operate and the fact that, that there's kind of, if you bucket it into three different ways, one way is, hiding, lying, everyone blaming each other, just trying to not screw up. And that's kind of one way. The second way, and this is where most product teams are, is called feature factory. This is, we're doing lots of stuff and just crank. But are we having the impact that we want? I don't know. We don't have time to think about that. Like, just ship the next thing. That is a stressful place to be because there's a lot of work and a lot of asks and lots of hours. The best place can still sometimes require a lot from you in terms of the workload, but it's, are we focused on the right things? Are we learning and iterating as we go? And the product teams that can do that well, I found, are less stressed and produce much better results. So yeah, company is a big part, manager is a big part, but then there's these ways of working. And so, yeah, it can be difficult.
For sure. And my 2 cents there is just like managing your calendar, right? Like I block out time on my calendar, even if it's not a meeting. So that way people don't put meetings on my calendar because it's already full of things that I know that I need to get done for the week. So I try to do that Sunday night before the week even starts, because once Monday happens, people will start putting meetings on your calendar for you, and then you'll lose all your time.
Yep, great point.
Well, so we do have 5 minutes left, so I'll try to squeeze one more in, if that's okay. Rajath asks, kind of along the same lines of trying to get into product, what are some of the things that you look for on a resume before calling a candidate for an interview?
Yeah, for me, I mean, a resume, the goal of a resume is to get an interview. And so, I mean, first and foremost, I'll say, ideally, when someone sees your resume, it's not the first time they've met you. Ideally, you've been introduced through a common connection. You've reached out through an email. You have a cover letter. A cover letter, I like someone said the difference between a resume and a cover letter is a resume says, I want a job. A cover letter says, I want this job. Because if you take time to actually, and a cover letter, I mean, today that's kind of an email, but like to say, I've learned about your company. I've thought about this role and how I can fit into that. With the resume specifically, some things that I look for are concise, should be 1 page, should be well written. I want to see action and kind of outcome oriented bullets there. And ideally, I want to see either applied, like, you've been a PM, or, you have directly applied experience, or you've thought about how to translate the experience you have into a resume. So you said, yeah, I was in a marketing role, but here are the product type things that I did. Here's the metrics that I drove, and that type of thing is really helpful. So those are things that I look for in a resume.
Cool. Thanks, Ryan. I know we probably have more questions, but we're running out of time. So I appreciate your time coming on, and a wealth of insight from a lot of different experiences that you've had. So thanks for joining and sharing with the group and with the broader audience once this goes to the public.
Cool. Yeah, happy to have the conversation.
That was Ryan Seamons, founder at Groove. Such great advice that I think is often slept on in content around product management. It's one thing to put your head down and focus on the hard skills of product and executing your day-to-day, but at the end of the day, we have to treat our careers as products. And Ryan's advice definitely equipped us with a better understanding of how specific types of conversations help enable our career growth. If you want to pick up a copy of those cards Ryan talked about and showed on the video version of this episode, head over to meetgroove.com, click on products, and you'll find the cards there. But to make it easy, I put the link in the show notes that takes you directly to those cards. And while you're in the show notes grabbing that link, there's another link to leave me voice messages. If you have feedback on the pod, product questions you'd like to have answered, or just want to say hi, I'd love to hear from you. So thanks for joining me today on Lessons in Product Management, and I'll see you next week.